We're now on chapter 5 of Romans. Paul has spent the whole of chapter 4 explaining that righteousness, that is, the right way to behave towards God, is faith. And a person who does act in that way is considered righteous in God's sight. Chapter 5 then starts with the conclusions reached in chapter 4. Since we've been declared righteous through faith, we are no longer enemies of God, but have peace with him. We have a good relationship with him. It's very simple, really. We have said to God that we believe what he says, that the sacrifice of Jesus is enough. And God has proved that it's enough by raising Jesus from the dead. You'll have heard it said many times that faith is depending on God. And that's exactly what has happened. You've said to God that you're going to depend on what he has said about the sacrifice of Jesus, and God justifies you as a result. He has replied that you're right in what you've said. That's the right position to take in relation to something that God says or does. As a result of all this, we're at peace with God. This is the answer to the wrath of God spoken of in chapter 1. Wrath is no longer there. We're at peace with God. In verse 2 then, he says, not only has Jesus brought justification and peace, we've also have access into this realm of grace in which we now stand. The Greek word stand is the same as the word for established. We are firmly planted in a new realm. God's way of operating in this realm is grace. It's not a once-off action. It's not like a stopover at some airport on the way to a final destination. It is the destination, the country, the realm, the new kingdom of grace or favor. And on top of that, we also rejoice in the hope of gaining back the glory of God, which we lost through sin. You remember Romans 3:23. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Eternal life has been restored. And because we were destined to death because of sin, and the full measure of that life then will be given back at the final resurrection. Verse 3, however, is a little bit harder to take. We also rejoice in tribulation, says Paul. And by tribulation, Paul was talking of the persecutions that both he and the Romans had suffered as a result of their faith. The outcome is that it develops patience, or the ability to bed down and endure difficulty. And this in turn develops experience or character, and that in turn develops hope. So we're back to hope again. But the hope is getting stronger and stronger as a result. The hope of full resurrection, is that well-founded? Is it just wishful thinking? No, says Paul, for in verse 5 he says, hope doesn't make us disappointed because of God's love poured out into our hearts. How does that make sense? How does an experience of God's love ensure something in the future? Many people have experienced the love of a boy to a girl or vice versa. It's all absorbing. It takes over everything. It becomes a very fulfilling thing in life. But does that mean the future is secure? Will they always love me, is the question. And that's the question here. How does God's love for me now mean the future will turn out as I hope? And this is where Paul invites us to consider the nature of God's love. In verses 6 to 8, he says, people don't tend to give their life for a righteous man, maybe perhaps for a good man, but God's love is shown for us in that Christ died when we were weak, when we were sinners. In other words, there was nothing good about us that merited the death of Jesus. So what is the point Paul is making about the love of God towards us? That it was not our goodness or our good behavior that provoked God's love towards us. Why is that important? Well, Paul is saying that the character of God doesn't change. If he loved us then, without reference to our behavior, then that's still the way he loves us now. But an even stronger point is this: if we were declared in a good relationship with God because of the death of Jesus, then we shall certainly be saved from God's wrath through Jesus. Why? Because Jesus is now alive. And verse 10 sums this all up. If we were reconciled with God through Jesus' death, how much more can be gained now that he's alive? If we were reconciled when we were enemies, how much more will he do now that we're his friends? If Jesus' death brought reconciliation now, then how much more will his life bring salvation? Salvation from what? The coming wrath of God on sin. His death dealt with sin once for all. His life from the dead is God's verdict that he'll no longer bring that against us. So when the future judgment comes, the living Jesus is our guarantee before God that we will be saved from future condemnation. And Paul finishes up the argument in verse 11. He says, we also rejoice in God through whom we've received the reconciliation. This is an important verse too. It's one thing to say that Jesus died for us and that our future is secure. It's another thing to say that God is happy with the outcome and happy with us. Have you ever been in a situation where an issue has been resolved, but one side only accepts the solution reluctantly? For the next while, you avoid that person until they cool down. That's absolutely not the situation with God. He loved us from the start. He gladly provided salvation for us. He provided that through Jesus, and he's very, very satisfied with the result. And our reconciliation with God is something we can rejoice in and enjoy.